Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 3 of the Open Source Frontiers podcast. I am pleased to be here with the Chinstrap folks, Heather Meeker and Sabir Ibrahim. Why don't y'all introduce yourselves? I'll let Heather go first, ladies first.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thanks for having us. So I'm a lawyer and an investor, and in both aspects, I specialize in open source software. I guide a lot of companies through the strategy of doing open source releases, and in particular, building businesses around open source. And I learned to program in 1968. So which means I don't know how to program anymore. But I do have a soft spot in my heart for software, and I love talking to people who are building businesses in that area.
That's wonderful. Sabir?
I'll start by saying I learned to program in 1998, and I don't know how to program anymore, given everything that's happening. So I'm Sabir, also an open source licensing and compliance attorney. Open source is very near and dear to my heart. As part of my law practice, I counsel clients on open source licensing compliance, open source licensing enforcement, open source, the licensing and strategy, as well as general, technology transactions. Heather and I also co-founded Chinstrap Community, which is a resource center for, commercial open source software entrepreneurs, investors, and others who are interested in the commercial open source software ecosystem. And as part of that, we, create content, we provide resources, workshops, trainings, fireside chats, things like that. So really excited to be here. And, thank you for having us, Christian.
Yeah, I'm excited to have y'all on here, and thank you for agreeing to join. I know I got to go through y'all's workshop, and it just dawned on me that open source isn't just this dependency-driven project that is in everybody's response, but you can actually capitalize and help work it to be self-sustaining. And y'all's workshop was very enlightening, especially with the different licensing types and stuff like that, and how to manage all these different things that people who just build software don't think of typically. The amount of projects I've seen without even a license in the repository.
That's not
good. Yeah, with y'all's, I did want to ask too, what got y'all into open source to begin with? I know, Heather, you started in 1968. What about your training?
That was before open source. I got started in it because when I started working as a lawyer, which was in the mid-90s, my clients started asking me about open source software. And at the time, lawyers were, I would say, actively hostile to the notion of open source, because you would ask an IP lawyer and they lived in a different world, and so IP lawyers at the time mostly said, oh, no, you can't use that stuff. It's not backed up by a vendor. There are no indemnities if you get sued, and so forth and so on. And I just thought, okay, that's not the right answer, because my clients are startups and they have all this free software they can use, and they need a better answer. The answer can't just be no. It has to be yes, but. And so I started learning about open source, and what I always like to say is that if you're in an organization and you know 10% more than the person in the next office, you're the expert. And so then people come and ask you questions and you learn more stuff and so forth. And so, I always thought it was really interesting and a little weird, and I liked it because it was kind of geeky and everything. But I did not expect it to last this long. I did not expect it to take over the world. I thought, oh, I'm learning about these interesting little puzzles, and I'm going to figure this stuff out. It'll be fun to counsel my clients about this. And then, fast forward years later, and all of a sudden, it's my entire world, So I got, like all good things, I got involved a little by accident. But if you find something you like, you really gotta like take it in your teeth and run with it.
Yeah. Different decade for me, but I very much was a video gamer because I didn't do academic studies that well, and got involved in with Bethesda Softworks, their release of these different like RPG things. But they released you couldn't commercialize it, but they released the creation engine behind it, and you could actually modify, and instead of a horse that you would be riding on, you could put a Lamborghini mesh file on top of it. And I didn't know how to do animations, but it was a galloping Lamborghini in medieval times. Little did I
Nice.
know that that would turn into a whole modding community, which is open source by default without knowing it was. I think they're like to 1 billion downloads just on the one game, different files. But and then fast forward a couple of years in the blockchain, that's like the whole basis of where everything is built, where you're not having financial systems, decentralization, transparency, neutrality, all kind of all stemming into open source ethos by default. But what about your experience, Sabir?
Yeah, so my very first experience with open source was as a undergrad computer science student and working with Linux. I remember sort of playing around with early versions of SUSE Linux and trying to install it on my laptop. And just, I kind of, became aware that Linux is sort of based on a different development model and a different licensing model than the software that, that I was used to. And I kind of, even at that time, developed a sense that like, hey, this is kind of unique, and this could be, this could be huge because it's a model that's based on collaboration and openness, which is different from sort of, the Microsoft and Mac OS model. And so that was where kind of the seed was planted. Ultimately decided to go to law school and focus on, the intersection between law and technology. Landed at a firm called Greenberg Traurig, where I worked for an attorney named Heather Meeker. And she, taught me pretty much everything I know about open source licensing, and the seed that had been planted many years earlier, was watered during that time. So that's kind of how I developed sort of, an expertise in open source licensing. Heather kind of became my mentor in that regard, and went on to serve at Amazon as a corporate counsel, did open source licensing and compliance for them. I was at Roku, led their open source legal compliance program, and then now I have my own practice, and Heather and I have been in touch for many years, and we decided to launch Chinstrap, and here we are.
Yep, that's an exciting story, especially when you're talking Linux, because Linux Foundation, which helps steward the community there, they're not even involved with just Linux anymore. They're all over the place, including Web3 now, which is interesting to see. But I was gonna ask y'all, because everything with open source always comes back to legal kind of being the pioneering frontier behind it, because you need to be able to do the yes buts to provide clarity for how things develop. What would y'all say the biggest challenges y'all have seen over the last decade related to open source law?
Well, I always say that when you practice in the area of open source, like you can't be wrong because it's almost no law. It's very it's very in technology. What people are doing always leads the law. The law is playing catch up. But in open source, that is true in spades. I mean, the big questions that people have about open source compliance and so forth, there are no case books you can read. There's almost no litigation. So it's very different task to figure out how to counsel in this area from what it would be in a more conventional area, because you have to really extrapolate from what the law is and importantly, what community practice is. So there are these complicated legal issues, which I won't like bore you with, but it's like, you know, the way people term it is what's a derivative work under GPL. I don't even think that's the right way to characterize it, but what is the scope of GPL? And people argue about that a lot. There's no real answer to it. So, you know, there's a lot of community practice about it though. And then there are very interesting things about the intersection of open source with patents and trademarks and so forth. So I'd say those are kind of the leading issues. But if you're in a space like this, you kind of have to get out ahead of it and say, okay, here's what I think the situation is. And, you know, you're not going to be able to say, and all these people say so too, because you may be the only one who's saying it. And you just have to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, and I know that's where I came into reference with y'all, because even the concepts behind blockchain of neutrality, especially when legal requires someone to be accountable, how do you map that? And then it's an open source culture implementation on top of it. Like DAOs are probably the biggest uncertainty, I think, at the moment.
DAOs are treacherous from a legal point of view, still.
Yeah. Where I think there's like 11,000 different implementations of DAOs written in different ways. So hopefully a playbook catches up at some point. But with that, the thing that y'all taught me that I didn't even really know was a thing was commercial open source software. I'll leave it to y'all to define it, if you don't mind, and kind of give an intro as to what it is.
Sabir, I'll kick this one over to you.
Yeah, well, first, I did want to share some thoughts on the question that you asked, like, what is the biggest challenge? And I think it's actually a pretty good segue into the, you know, a discussion of what is commercial open source. So in my view, at the risk of succumbing to recency bias, I think we are probably actually facing the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges that, you know, the open source movement has faced, and that is that there's a growing sense that we are currently in a state of transition. Software development, the very fundamental nature of it, is in a state of upheaval right now, with things like, you know, agentic AI and vibe coding and coding agents and all these kinds of things. Not just that, but the rise of AI itself, and how machine learning isn't really, you know, it kind of breaks a lot of the assumptions that have long underlie open source licensing practices, in the sense that machine learning isn't really, you know, a machine learning model. There's no source code there. It's not really, you know, it's not something you can break open and kind of analyze in the way that you can with, you know, traditional software and source code. So the quote unquote traditional open source licensing models presume that all software is just source code and maybe data. Whereas machine learning, it's kind of a new category, right? It doesn't fit neatly into either one. And so that's something that the community is currently grappling with. And how do you deal with that? How do you address that? And you put on top of that the fact that there's now so much AI generated code, and what are sort of all of the, you know, new licensing issues that are introduced by that. And in light of all those issues, I think we're currently in the phase that, you know, the greatest challenges, you know, in the history of the open source movement currently lie before us right now. Now, transitioning into it, you know, what is commercial open source? I think that the idea of building a company, a profitable business whose main mission and goal is to, you know, earn a profit for its shareholders, and building it around an open source software project is a concept that has really come into its own over the past, I would say, 10, 15 years, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things is pretty recent. So I would, you know, I'm not proposing like an official definition or anything like that, but the concept, you know, kind of the rough concept that we have been operating under is that a commercial open source software endeavor is one that is built around a software project whose source code is publicly available under one or more open source software licenses, and that software project forms a core part of that company's product or offering. I think that's maybe like a rough, I hesitate to even call it a definition, but sort of like a rough criterion for what constitutes open source. Now there's like some nuances in there in the sense of, okay, some licenses don't qualify as open source and they're source available. That's the term that's kind of been coined to describe those licenses. Does that constitute commercial open source? I'm not going to weigh in one way or the other, but I think that is essentially the criterion for what constitutes a commercial open source sort of enterprise. One thing that I will say it's not is that it's not necessarily a company that releases open source software, because then companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they've released more open source software than a lot of commercial open source companies, but that doesn't qualify them as commercial open source because their core products, their core services are not open source. So I think in order to be a commercial open source company, your core product has to be built around in some way an open source software project.
I see. Well, and with that, do you have two different case studies on how companies that fall under that cost category that are kind of polar to each other?
Go ahead, Sabir.
I would say, so yeah, this is something we talk about in our workshop in terms of like, what are the different models, right? So I'll give you, I guess, a little slice of, of what we have to say in the workshop on that. The company that kind of, really got the ball rolling, Red Hat, right? They, came up with this distribution of Linux that was very well suited to running on a server, and we're very well suited to like, building server infrastructure around it. And the model that they came up with to monetize that was to provide support subscriptions, QA, maintenance, things like that, because that distribution of Linux was being used by enterprises and organizations that sort of needed very heavy duty kind of, support to make sure everything was, that there was no interruption and downtime was minimized. So that is the niche that, or I shouldn't even call it a niche, that is kind of the opportunity that companies like Red Hat found, and they were able to build a very successful business around that. They were acquired by IBM for, I think a 10 or 11 figure sum. So that's what kicked it off. Now, that model is basically a services business, and it's not really, if you're looking to build a venture-backed startup, the Red Hat model is not the way to go. If you're looking to build a venture-backed startup around an open source software project, the Red Hat model is not the way to go. What is kind of the way to go, there are a number of different models. I'll focus on one or two of them. There's the SaaS model where, okay, you have this application that, is a SaaS application, and we provide the source code, under this open source license, and, anybody can run it, anybody can install it, anybody can use it. They don't have to pay us a dime. They don't have to get our permission, provided they comply with the, with the terms of the license. But if you don't want to bother with that, then hey, we have this SaaS offering, right? And we sell that just like any other SaaS, SaaS commercial product. But it's backed by this, open source project, and you have full transparency into what's being done with your data, because the source code is all publicly available, and there's a community built around it, and they contribute to it. They make pull requests and provide documentation and things like that. And so you leverage that community to build your SaaS business. And using that SaaS business, you also contribute back to the community and build up the open source side of it. So it's like a synergistic relationship there. So that's just one example. Another example is Open Core, where you have this core open source software project, and you sort of monetize it by building sort of add-on technologies, or supplemental things, or kind of supercharged versions, things like that. So there are a number of models. That's just two of them. But this is kind of exactly what we talk about in our workshops.
No, that's really good reference points. Especially, I've seen a need of it, at least in the Web3 space, because a lot of the development there's not necessarily commercial adoption there for the wholesale part. So a lot of it's subsidies, grants, a lot of MVPs get built, and it's all open source and mandated by the grant program itself. And a lot of people don't know how to scale that into something and just become a grant infrastructure recipient is their business model, which is not sustainable in the long term. So you end up with a lot of redundant things that people paid for, but not a lot of education on how you actually build a business around the things that you built. So I think that kind of helps, which aligns with a recent achievement of y'all's, something I called Cossmology, if you want to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So it's something we're really, really proud of. We just launched it about a month and a half ago. In earnest, we did a soft launch late last year, and then a month and a half ago we kind of went fully live with it. So Cossmology is a database, a directory of commercial open source software companies. We track things like who are their key personnel, their funding rounds, their valuation, to the extent that that information is available, their socials and communities, what are their core projects, and what sort of realm they fall into, whether it's a consumer-based product, cal.com, for example, or it's an more enterprise-focused company. We've tried to sort of become like kind of the product hunt, or the Crunchbase for the commercial open source software ecosystem. So, last count, I think we're at almost 1,200 companies on there. We're adding new companies every day. We're on all the major social network channels, and we tweet out company information. We also do a weekly newsletter called Cost Weekly, in which we curate like the biggest headlines from the past week in the commercial open source ecosystem, and we feature a number of companies from our database. So that's something we're really excited about. We've also mirrored a good chunk of the data on GitHub in a repository called Awesome Cost Companies, which follows kind of GitHub conventions. And so that's sort of presented in the form of a GitHub collection of data that people can view on that platform and contribute to. So yeah, I mean, it's something we're really, really excited about, and really invite the community to check it out, and give us your feedback. It's at cossmology.com with 2 S's, COSSMOLOGY.com.
I'll include the link in the video too, so people feel free to click it in the description. Related to that, with such a big reference database, what are some key trends or observations that you've seen out of that?
Yeah, I mean, well, so it's not just from that. I mean, we see there's plenty of trends that I'm seeing, in the sense of there are certain realms. I mean, look, personally, I believe that the future is open, and that things are trending towards open source at a minimum being sort of the default development model. But there are certain realms in which that has taken hold more quickly, and the trends that we're seeing in that regard: infrastructure technologies, development tools, databases, those types of technologies are very well suited to open source. And I think that we are almost at a point where we can say that open source is the default development and licensing model for technologies like that. If you're building a database, you've almost got to be open source in order for it to gain any traction. If you're building something that sits, on the infrastructure side in the technology stack, then you're going to get some serious pushback if it's not open source. I think that the cloud native era has created a lot of opportunities within open source, because there was a time when, and we did a video about this, there was a time when on-premises software was declared dead, or the very concept of it was declared dead, right? But to quote Mark Twain, it's like, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. We are now seeing I would say, a dramatic comeback in that very concept, right? Because for cloud native, it's, if I'm going to have something running in my cloud, I want maximum transparency on what exactly it is, maximum visibility on what exactly it is. I can't subscribe to your SaaS subscription. I can't have my data in your cloud. It has to be in my cloud. And if I'm going to run your software in my cloud, I have to know what it is. So open source is like tailor-made for that kind of that kind of priority. So those are the major trends that kind of come to my mind in terms of like what we're seeing, things for which, transparency, openness is a business imperative and not just sort of a philosophical ideal. That's where there are a lot of opportunities for, commercial open source entrepreneurs. And I'd love to hear Heather's thoughts as well, and just from what she's observed with our legal practice.
Well, I would just say that overall, one of the takeaways that we want people to get from Cossmology is that this is its own sector, and it's extremely robust. It's big, it's growing. There are a lot of reasons why. Sabir mentioned, some of the important ones, why it's growing and why the future is open. And if you look at the level of business that's being done by commercial open source companies, it's like, the GDP of a small nation. I mean, it's like, it's big. And while maybe it's a portion of the software business at this point, it's getting to be slowly a bigger and bigger portion of the software business. I would also say that, reports of the death of the software industry have been greatly exaggerated, because, all these things that people say about, well, SaaS is dead, software is dead, everything's dead, 1 week or another. But the point is that somebody has to provide all of the infrastructure to put all this great stuff together, including AI. And that's all going to be open source stuff, So there is plenty of room to make money providing the tools that hold all the infrastructure together and that guide the infrastructure. So it's still an extremely robust sector. I'm very bullish on it.
The thing that the point that Heather, excellent point that Heather you just mentioned, of all these or all these like dramatic proclamations that, oh, software is dead, open source is dead, SaaS is dead, this and that are dead. The only thing that those prove is that clickbait is not dead.
Yeah. I would say it's even gotten worse with AI bots and everything else, just trying to get following.
Yeah. But I mean, look, if you want to use AI, like, you don't just use a model, you use the model, you use a UI, you need orchestrators, you need logic, and there's all these layers, right? And computing is not getting simpler. It's getting to be more and more layers, and it has for the last 30, 40 years.
Well, what is it? The QCD drawing of that one peg.
Yeah,
We're just
exactly.
adding more stacks on top of it.
The most famous such drawing. But it's a great one because that is really the way the software business works, and there's just more and more stuff all the time. So yeah, so I'm literally putting my money in commercial open source.
Well, even I'm putting a bet on it too that I do think it's going to take over Web3 if the people can get aligned and the education implemented, because that's the only way these ecosystems survive over time. Because a lot of they're good at funding their own stuff, and as you get more enterprises and stuff that way, all the protocols and because it's built on open source tech, a lot of the technology itself has to have some open source component. So all of them are going to be cost by default at some point. It's just teaching these people how to scale things to do right, which I was going to get into. Do you all have some general patterns and anti-patterns for people to reference if they're thinking about adopting a cost model?
Well, I'd say the most important thing is that the cost aspect of it can't be just a come on or an upsell thing. You have to have something that is actually useful as open source. And it's great to sell enterprise features and so, but there's nothing wrong with any of that, but you don't want to sell something that is just, it isn't useful on its own, and you just have to buy proprietary software in order to make it work. You need to understand that the cost business has at least two products which are complementary and not substitutes for each other. One is the cost part, and which is free, goes to the community and so forth, and the other is your enterprise commercial product, and they should, as Sabir mentioned, they should have synergy with each other, but they shouldn't have to cannibalize each other. And I think a lot of people, when they start businesses, and sometimes when they get more successful at these businesses, they kind of make a thinking error. Well, if we could just monetize all this cost stuff, we'd be great. But that's really not how it works. And, various tech entrepreneurs have said, it's great to have a product, but if you want to be really successful, you need an ecosystem. And the ecosystem comes from the open source is the best way to build an ecosystem. So it has a potential to be a huge springboard for success.
I think, and what I'll add to that is that the word that we keep coming back to when we teach our workshops and when we kind of, when we counsel entrepreneurs and any type of messaging that we engage in, the key word that we keep coming back to is community, right? And building a successful commercial open source business, you really can't do that without building a thriving, vibrant community. And you kind of have to accept, and I even hesitate to use that term accept, but you, for the lack of a better one, you have to accept that your community will be built in ways that may not directly feed into your commercial offering, but if you have the right perspective about it, will be indispensable to your commercial offering. Because once you have built a thriving community around your open source software project, which you are monetizing on the commercial end, it makes so many things easier. You don't have to spend nearly as much money on customer acquisition. You don't have to spend nearly as much money on sales and marketing. You have sort of a built-in kind of ecosystem, a built-in you software testers that are just ready in there. And and it can't be like, you can't approach it in a way of like, okay, we're just doing it as a way to offload development. No, it has to be truly synergistic. I realize that that's a bit of a cringeworthy corporate term, but it really does have meaning in this instance, that it has to be in a way that, we're cultivating this community that, is going to help us in our commercial in various ways. It's going to help us with our commercial offering, and the fruits of that commercial offering will in many ways go back into the community. So you really kind of have to approach it that way and really develop that sort of mindset.
Well, and I would even argue too, one of the misconceptions I see people think is when they hear open source or they're adopting it, there's a one-dimensional focus on like the fifth dimensional aspects of open source as a term, where to them it's either just the code and it's open. There's a community standard thing, which if you say you're open source and you have a really bad license and or practice or you're trying to monetize, you will get ridiculed heavily because of such associations. I wouldn't say they're costs per se, but gaming, I follow gaming news quite a bit from bad practices. They're theoretically open core. You buy the game and they typically have add-ons or DLCs that you can purchase. And then they have an open engine where people can mod and add things, but they can't sell it per se unless the company is going to get some cut of the profit. But the thing that's become out of that is live service as a game, where the idea is you release such an unfinished product that people buy, and then they start having to pay for the complete upgrade. Like one of the most controversial things was someone releasing a NFT for a game character in it. And it was only the color blue, but it was $20. You paid $60 for the game. And then on top of that, once you got the NFT and you were able to claim it, they ended up canceling the game servers a year after launch. So your NFT is useless to the non-existent service practice now. So I do think people, and I think they kind of slightly try to advertise it like it was a big open source community centered thing, and it wasn't. So I definitely agree with you on points there. I think you're on mute, Heather.
Yeah. There's a difference between an open platform and open source. So like you might recall that when Apple first came out with the iPhone, people said, oh, this is open source because anyone can develop for it. And that's an open platform, but it's not open source. They're really quite different. Open source really means code that people can share and improve and so forth. So they're not to say that other kinds of business models are not correct, but they don't have the same characteristics. But people really do like to open wash things, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's where marketing blends into terminology.
Yeah.
There's those of us who practice in this area, especially us attorneys, but also non-attorneys as well, we kind of have a pet peeve of, the term open source really being thrown around, in the larger rubric, the term open being thrown around, just for, marketing purposes, when the underlying technology has really nothing to do with being, or is not open or even open source in any way, shape, or form. That is a problem. And I think, kind of going back to what I mentioned about sort of your great question about what the challenges facing the open source movement are, I think that might be one of them, is sort of, the term open source kind of getting misused, and making sure that it continues to have meaning and continues to at least stand for something, is going to be a challenge that, I think we'll have to conquer at some point.
Well, and as you were alluding to earlier, with the changing of how open source is done in the future now, especially where agents will become primary contributors to things. I was curious on y'all's thoughts to that, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, Google also recently went to a closed source LLM with Nightforce and kind of shut down Gemini, or at least maybe it's Gemini is no longer open source. I'm confusing the headline a bit, but it was kind of the question came into, well, if agents and AI are acting autonomously, quote unquote, for the rise towards AGI, we need open source code to start verifying like what the actual thinking is behind the engine. And if everyone goes closed source, it's kind of against AI ethics in a sense, if that makes sense.
Well, there's really not much open source AI. Nobody really knows how that's defined. There was an attempt to do some definitions, but they basically didn't go very far. But most AI is done via SaaS, and it's not open by any stretch of the imagination. So, you know, I do believe that there are real benefits to openness around AI, but it's much more complex than just saying it's open source, because it's a completely different animal, and there's no definition of what it means to make AI open. The bid ask on it is, you know, well, you'd start with an open source license, but giving people the right to modify machine learning models is maybe like giving the sleeves of your vest, you know, it's like maybe not that meaningful. But also, then there's a question of how much information the vendors have to disclose. What data was it trained on? Is the data freely available? The answer is almost never. Are they just required to describe the data? And that bid ask is where most of the definitions failed, because there were people who wanted an open source AI to be something where all the training data was freely available. But there's just almost nothing like that in the marketplace, you know, because it requires too much data. And then, you know, so that was sort of the hardcore position. And then the more middle of the road position was it has to be under an open source license, and you have to disclose what the data is. But at that point, are you really accomplishing what open source sets out to accomplish? I don't think so. And yet it's super important that there be transparency. It's just that you're not going to get there the same way that you do with open source software.
Would this analogy be appropriate, that it's kind of like an artist before they put the painting or start painting? They have to be transparent about what they're trying to paint, but you don't know what dimension it may be.
I guess that's pretty good. I've kind of, you know, my attitude about it right now is like, I don't think there's going to be a useful definition for a long time. And yet people will demand transparency. So maybe either regulations or custom and practice will arise around that, but it's not going to happen in the same way it did with open source, which was really a grassroots, we're giving everything away kind of model.
Yeah. Well, and that one overtook the world, but it all passion and community behind it. But I do think, at least from what I'm seeing, the biggest rise in legality to AI is the outputs and consequences from outputs, especially when it's like if it assisted in someone wanting to do something against themselves kind of thing, and it being a chatbot and it's quote unquote helping with mental health and stuff like that. But
yeah, I mean, those kinds of it. Yeah, look, I mean, the rise of AI has introduced all kinds of like novel, or at least, you know, ignited interest in questions that were only theoretical before. But now, and much of this has nothing to do with open source. It's just, you know, how do we come to terms, or how do we come to grips with like this new technology and all of the things that it enables and all of the social consequences that are coming about from that. In terms of the specific issue you raised with respect to the outputs of AI, I mean, that's one of the biggest questions in copyright right now, is that, okay, you know, this image or video or what have you that was generated completely by AI, what's the copyright status of it? And I think right now the prevailing thought is that content that is wholly generated by AI, there is no copyright in it. my understanding is that at least here in the United States, the Copyright Office refuses to register or refuses to, grant applications for registration of content that lacks a human author. Now, having said that, like, that's because of people who are trying to make a point. And I think what's, kind of the textbook case is a guy who, like, he had some image generation model and he used it to generate an image that he submitted to the Copyright Office for an application. He listed the model name as the author. And he was trying to make a point that, okay, AI generated stuff should be copyrightable. And then, the Copyright Office denied it. And he appealed, and it went into the courts, and it's still working its way through. But yeah, I mean, that's an issue. And the thing is that most stuff is not wholly generated by AI, right? You use AI to make a first pass, and then you take it and you throw it into Photoshop and you add your own tweaks and all this stuff. And so what's the copyrights? What's the IP status of whatever results from that process? That's an issue that's still, being worked through by all the relevant authorities.
Well, I got a fun reference for you to look up later. There's a gaming developer, again, gaming, called Bungie. They built Halo, so you might have seen that name with Microsoft and the big Cortana, etc. But they did their own separate thing and started releasing a IP called Marathon, kind of a reboot of the series. They were going to do a dev workshop, and it came out that they had used AI in generating a lot of like their design assets and stuff, but the AI centered around one IP centric that belonged to a painter. 98% or something like that of all the gaming graphics and everything had to do with this artist's artwork. And so they did a demo where they had zero feed, zero technology. It was just them doing a fireside. There's nothing to discuss, embarrassing PR. They ended up turning it around, but it was one of those big things where the system kind of failed because there was no quality assurance done, I guess, homework. So I was a little fun. Be aware of exactly what you're pulling, at least if you're going to use it in a public setting or claim it under your IP.
Exactly. And, headlines like that are not uncommon these days, just because there's so much uncertainty and so much, it's a really kind of Wild West era in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring it back a little bit too. So one thing I've liked the idea of costs behind, in which y'all know, so low context is open source sustainability. I'm like a massive ruthless advocate for it. On trying to make sure projects have needs met if they're heavily adopted and there's a data-centric use case there and or accentuating circumstances. But it's more than just, so reference point is we have a treasury, we had money, and we funded several programs that met different project needs. But an idea is if a project potentially can adopt a self-sustaining piece where it no longer requires grants. I feel like costs is a perfect model for that to explore and kind of build that into long-term roadmaps for blockchain evolution of its open source culture. I was curious on how y'all might see plugins for that or how you could go about doing that potentially.
Well, you do need some kind of sustainability model. And as you mentioned, grants are attractive, but they only take you so far. It's not going to be long-term sustainability. There is always a way to figure out a cost model around almost anything. You do have to get the licensing right, but the licensing is more of a tactical choice. And, you use lawyers or experts for that, but what you want to accomplish can get done. And you can do plugins definitely in a cost model. I mean, that's what WordPress does, right? They've been extraordinarily successful. So yeah, it can definitely get done. But I think there's not like a big track record in the Web3 space about exactly how to do this stuff. There've been some successes, but I think people are still working it out.
Yeah, Web3 is the experimental playground for every ideology under the sun. If you don't like government systems, try to rework it there. Yeah, my whole thing was we originally did pilots based on nomination and criteria that way, but then instead of it being the original idea is if you build a sustained system for these projects to be funded, maintained, and contributor pipelines, etc., it'll build a risk assessment and a good case for businesses to want to incorporate that technology in their SBOM and then grow things that way. Drive transaction volumes, which are fees, taxpayer funds go back to the treasury, and it's a self-sustaining cycle. What I'm even trying to get to is actually make that more of a term-based thing to reduce the demand on the treasury allocation and try to pilot success case stories about turning open source projects into products themselves that still keep kind of like that middle ground so you don't have just the dichotomy. And then that goes to the adage, you give the man a fish and you teach him how to fish. So kind of do both things. But yeah, exploring civic structures that way.
One thing I wanted to say is this issue also highlights the importance of community. And, there's been a lot written these days about sort of sustainability within open source. And, there are instances of projects that, form the backbone of, certain enterprise technologies that are just, sustained based on the efforts of, one or two solo developers who are, doing it on a volunteer basis, and then, they're starting to get overwhelmed, experiencing burnout, raising the question of, okay, what happens? This library is like really important and really critical for a lot of different things. And, we've got to make sure it stays alive in some form. I'm of the belief that there is no problem in open source that the concept or the concept of community cannot solve, and especially these days with the rise of technology. It used to be that, like, okay, you have this massive code base, and even if you can't just pluck it and hand it over and whatever, because like they won't know what to do with it, right? Well, that's not really the case anymore. You have sort of all these tools that have emerged, AI tools that can go through a code base and describe exactly what every component does, exactly how it works. And, these technologies are getting better and better. So I think that any open source project that has a good community around it is going to be sustainable. And then there's a lot of devil in the details there, in the sense of, okay, what is a good community? But I think community is the key to sustainability. If I could sum it up, that's how I would sum it up within the open source world.
Well, I would even say it's definitely a big factor into projects. Now, if they're heavily adopted like Log4Shell and you only have a 4-person team, there's not a lot of community around the project. You focus efforts towards that, as well as some monetary compensation. But if you have a big project that has zero funding and everyone's using it, they just need sustainability that way. But if you have a project that someone built off a grant and there's not much adoption unless a program aligns to it, doesn't necessarily need money. We had a bug bounty platform that was built via grant, and it wasn't until we put in this whole open source initiative that program actually had utility. So different things to outline that way. So I think I covered kind of the major interest topics. Something I like to, as we get closer to the end time, what's one thing no one knows about you? And I'll start with Heather, unless y'all need some more time to think first.
Oh, goodness. Wow.
I can give an example. I have 9 sisters. No one knows that. I'm the only boy. On my wife's side, there's only one boy cousin. All the other nieces or cousins are female. And then even with my sisters and the grandchildren, there's only like 2 boys to 13 grandkids. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, Heather, I hope you'll forgive me for this, but Heather's a drummer. A lot of people don't.
But a lot of people know that.
A lot of people do, but a lot of people don't.
I was once a professional musician, actually.
What genre was your
whatever anyone would pay me to do. That's the only answer any professional musician ever gives. But yeah, I mean, I was in music for a long time. It's terrible business. Being a lawyer is a lot better.
I can imagine. I was gonna ask, how much would you charge to do a Slipknot cover?
I actually have a personal rule now that I will not take money for playing music anymore. It's because when I was playing professionally, I found that getting paid changes the way you think about it. And I wanted to do it for the fun of it. I didn't want to do it for the money.
I heard that in college, that if you enjoy something, don't major in it.
Absolutely. The world, I'll say this, the world needs more people who are not interested in becoming rich and famous artists of various kinds. Like, it's like, do the music, do the writing, do the whatever you're doing for the joy of it, but don't turn it into a living. That just spoils it.
I think that's what happened to Austin, Texas. What about yourself, Sabir?
So me, I have a lot of nerdy interests, but I have some interests that are not typically associated with nerds, particularly in the sports world. So I'm a huge college football fan, which means that, September is my favorite month of the year. Huge, Michigan Wolverine, go blue. So Christian, you being from Austin, or you being from Texas, I think you probably
Spurs guy, NBA, San Antonio.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, the finals are starting.
Yeah, you're having a good year.
Madness too.
Yeah, there you go. So no, me, it's like Saturday is kind of a holy day in our house. Sunday to a lesser extent, and my son is a huge NFL fan. But yeah, that's kind of my what I do to decompress outside of work is I go on college football message boards and argue with people about stuff that no sane person should care about.
I have to ask, is you doing fantasy football too? Or have you steered clear of that? Fantasy football?
Oh, fantasy football. That's more of an NFL thing. And I kind of, I've steered clear of it just because, I don't need yet another productivity killer in my life. My son is really into, because he's more of an NFL fan than a college fan. So he's, any given moment during the season, he's part of like 3 or 4 different fantasy leagues, half of which he's commissioner of. But yeah, no, my, born and raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I was, indoctrinated into the college game from a very early age. So that's kind of my passion, I guess.
I gotcha. Well, I went to UTSA, so go Runners, quote unquote. I was just happy they did awful their first year, but they did their pre-warm-up game, I think, against Oklahoma State, and it was like 60-some to 40-some. Defense was non-existent for the teams, but the fact that a startup team could even score against Oklahoma State was all we cheered for. We were winning losers.
And those are highly entertaining games too.
Yeah.
So no defense, but offense keeps the eyeballs glued to the screens.
Yep, for sure. Well, I invite y'all to come back again as things develop and as we start to see the change with open source AI. Don't even get me started on quantum risk and mythos. Quantum is like changing the state of everything in crypto right now. Bitcoin's governance is unknown because are they going to freeze Satoshi's big wallet because it'll be at risk in the future and could crash Bitcoin prices and go against the governance ethics, or is there different compromises? So fun stuff to look at in the future. But thank y'all again for joining and coming. For everyone who's watching, resources will be below. I heavily recommend y'all reach out and talk with Heather and Sabir. They have free consultation for people under Intersect in the Cardano ecosystem for cost stuff, and then they do workshops periodically. Yeah, anything else I missed?
No, just thank you very much. And yeah, do check out Chinstrap community because there are tons of resources there and it's all free, no strings attached.
And I do heavily emphasize the amount of content there, heavily underutilized at the moment. So
yeah, please do check us out. And we'd love your feedback on Cossmology. So be sure to check that out as well.
thank you all so much.
Take care.